in terms of children's developmental outcomes, I won't go into too much detail on these because I'll run over into Craig's time. But where we looked using, again, an industry standard tool, where we looked at children's emotional problems, for example, being very easily upset, being very anxious, or even withdrawn from interactions in terms of their emotional symptoms, what we see is actually the majority of breaking the cycle children, and this compares to UK normed clinical data, the majority of breaking the cycle children don't have specific issues at the moment. It might be because most of those children are quite young, or it might be because the risks that they've been exposed to haven't yet reached them in terms of their development. But there is, as you can see across the borderline and abnormal, those are wording I would not choose, but we can't infringe on copyright of people that develop the outcome tools, and unfortunately their classifications do say normal, borderline, abnormal, which is not choice wording as far as we're concerned. But we do see that there is some risk for a much smaller percentage of children, and that risk does reduce over time as a result of engaging in breaking the cycle. When we look at the follow-up studies, we ask parents about what they think is helping with their children's development, and this is what they're telling us. Now, in terms of conduct problems, which is children's ability in this context not to rush into interactions, and also in terms of not having temper tantrums and sort of behavioural issues like that. What we can see is that a lot more of our children are starting to show some conduct issues, but again, that does reduce over time for these children, although there is typically a third to a quarter of children that do still experience some issues. And in terms of hyperactivity, which usually these are the same groups of children when we looked individually, what we can see is that 65% of those children don't have any issues on assessment, and that increases to 77% by discharge. But again, we've still got a third of children that have some issue with hyperactivity, being restless, not being able to stick to tasks, and not getting tasks completed. And peer problems, this shows a similar series of outcomes as well, but slightly higher at discharge. And in peer problems, examples of these issues would involve children saying that they feel bullied, that they're not making friends, that they're getting into conflict with their peers. Now, in terms of pro-social behaviours, so the ability to share, to make friends and sustain relationships, children don't seem to have, of all of the outcome areas, this seems to be where there's least risk at all, if you like, but also where the outcome is also the greatest as well. And we think what we are hoping to see over time, when we can look at more detail at children's developmental outcomes, is to see what the risk and resilience picture is here. And we're defining resilience as the ability to bounce back despite adversity. And we obviously know that pro-social behaviours serve as a protective factor, so whether this will enhance resilience outcomes over time, which is something that we're going to develop qualitatively into the evaluation model to be able to measure in more detail over time. So for children's outcomes, the sort of message is essentially that actually not all of these children in all of these families that engage in breaking the cycle are sitting within the clinical significance of concern for compared to the national norms of children. Most of our children at the moment don't seem to have any issue, but of course there's a lot of watchful waiting that needs to go on to see whether it's just that we're picking children up before, or we're able to see them before these issues might start emerging. And of course, this is the importance of follow-up and long-term work, is to see how this might change over time, this pattern. In terms of parents' health, I'm going to be very quick with this because it's important to move on to Craig's presentation. Now, in terms of mental health, we use the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence tools, recommended tools for this, which is the GAD, which is the Generalised Anxiety Disorder Scale, and the PHQ, which is a Patient Health Questionnaire. Those two tools, the NICE recommend using. If you use nothing else, they recommend using these two outcome tools because they're used within the NHS. They're endorsed by Public Health England, and essentially what we're able to capture here is more detail rather than asking parents generically about their physical and psychological health, which is what happens to the treatment outcome profile tool. This gives a lot more detail around anxiety and depression. This tool is used by every GP and typically within hospitals for anybody that's expressing any concerns around anxiety and depression. So they are the national industry. And what we can see is that on assessment, that the majority of parents on assessment are disclosing some serious concerns around anxiety and depression. We appreciate this tool is not, the only way to measure anxiety and depression, but it's an important indicator. Now, most of our break in the cycle practitioners do not do lots of detailed, specific work around anxiety and depression for parents, and most of them are sort of seen as a subclinical population and not really picked up by any mental health services either necessarily. But what we can see is there is a key issue here for parents, and it's no surprise given the worries and fears and challenges that parents have, particularly around this issue about concerns for their children's well-being and safety. But what we see is on discharge, and parents again in the follow-up, in the long-term follow-up and detailed interviews, they do talk about this. What happens by the time discharge occurs, that actually the majority of parents, 63% of our parents for depression, and 70% of parents, and they're usually the same parents within on discharge measuring anxiety, don't display any clinical symptoms at all. And we think that what's happening is breaking the cycle is having a really big impact on giving parents a professional to be able to speak to who helps to really calm down any anxiety and symptoms around depression, and the parents are able to address this over time. So this is really a key and important finding, and it was almost on a wing and a prayer that we ended up measuring this. We just needed something else in addition to asking parents on a scale of 0 to 20, which is what the treatment outcome profile tool does. Could you tell us about your mental health, as though the whole of mental health could be charted on one line. We found that that tool was really, really unable to tell us any detail. And when we actually used another tool and started to look at parents' mental health, this is what we found. So we think that that's a key outcome for breaking the cycle. So in terms of, and I'm just going to wrap up now, in terms of the positive outcomes that we've seen again this year, and we tend to see these positive outcomes reflected, as Tim mentioned, year on year for several years now, what are we doing about them? Well, currently, one of the big pieces that's actually happened as a result of having Annie McFarlane and Charlotte Simpson on board is that we've really reshaped the evaluation framework over time. And what we've also done is that we put all of these evaluation tools onto Addaction's central monitoring system, so that everybody can really take monitoring outcomes as a serious part of their job and see it as integral to practice, something that they can do, something useful with the findings. And that's meant bringing the delivery teams, the data teams, and also the individual breaking the cycle managers on board who are really supporting their team. I'm sure Siobhan will be a testament to that, of the importance of bringing the whole team together and integrating into the wider delivery team. So that's one part. The other part is that we've really had to learn some lessons which have been very useful for us with the evaluation from Warwick's piece of work that they've done with social investment, again working with Charlotte, and also from this long-term follow-up study as well. And so we will be developing, if you like, the evaluation framework as a result of that. One of the things that we have done is we measure the same metrics that Charlotte and I developed together, sitting alongside Warwick. We measuring everything that's was measured within social investment is now rolled out nationally, something that Tim really insisted on that we do, so that standard practice is followed with regards to outcome monitoring. And the other piece that we've done is that we've integrated the long-term follow-up outcome tools into the standard BTC practice, so that we can build in following families through over a very long period of time now, which we think is really, really important and sort of groundbreaking as we go forward. And then finally, one of the really important pieces is Dr. Melanie Day, who's one of Addaction's, I think she's the only clinical psychologist actually employed by Addaction. She's pretty amazing. She's developed, actually I think that was working alongside you as well, wasn't it, Craig? Yeah, the psychosocial interventions framework for all of Addaction's psychosocial treatment approach. And what we're hoping to do is to be able to incorporate her model into and to shape the breaking the cycle model further as well. It goes without saying that lots of really, really important contributions have been made to the independent evaluations year on year. We really want to thank Zurich Community Trust, who've been with Addaction right from the start. In fact, commissioned the first ever evaluation, which we're very, very I have a lot of appreciation for, because it actually means a lot to be able to evaluate outcomes year on year through Addaction. But also, most importantly, is actually to thank and acknowledge the BTC families and the teams that are able to do this really important work. We also thank Tim and Anna and Annie McFarlane, the data officer, who's been key in bringing the sort of project together in terms of data and monitoring, and the shaping up really that we've been doing with Warwick University and with Charlotte Simpson as well. And also, of course, the local commissioners who are driving and requesting and quite rightly demanding regular outcome reports for their services, so that they can monitor very closely what the outcomes are, and know that basically they're investing wisely in Addaction's break and cycle service. So thank you very much.